One key outcome of the summit is that the Group of 20 will replace the G8 as the permanent Council on Global Economic Cooperation, reflecting the larger role of countries like China, India, and Brazil in the world economy. The main focus of what's intended as new, broader economic cooperation was how to readjust global imbalances, how to prevent another financial crisis. To that end, leaders agreed late today on proposals designed to revamp the global financial system. Among them, issuing stronger rules on how much capital banks must hold to cushion against future losses, to be rolled out by 2012. Linking executive pay to long-term value creation, not excessive risk-taking, no bonus caps, however. Reducing global imbalances, and creating a so-called peer review system under which countries, with assistance from the International Monetary Fund, would assess each other's policies on issues like national savings and spending. Late this afternoon, President Obama held a press conference.
And here in Pittsburgh, we've taken several significant steps forward to secure our recovery and transition to strong, sustainable, and balanced economic growth. We've brought the global economy back from the brink. We laid the groundwork today for long-term prosperity as well. Today we took bold and concerted action to secure that prosperity and to forge a new framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth.
Next year, summits will take place in Canada and Korea. Our economics correspondent Paul Salman has been in Pittsburgh this week. I talked with him a short time ago. So, Paul, what are you hearing about the ultimate significance of this summit?
Well, I was really amazed. Jeffrey Sachs, who's been on our show since 1986, I interviewed him today right about here, and he said he thought it was a historic occasion. Now, you know, he's always like the Jiminy Cricket of the world economy, always saying what should be, that you're not doing right. And he said historic occasion because of the inclusion of the emerging economies, the Brazils, the Chinas, the Indias, after so many years when it was an elite club, going from, I don't know, less than 1 billion people represented, something like that at the G8, to something like 4 billion plus in the G20, which is what this, after all, is.
Well, you know, we saw your interview yesterday with President Lula da Silva of Brazil.
Right.
Saying much the same, that the importance of moving to a G20. So seem to you that's what people are picking up most on out of this?
Certainly that was the thing that struck me most. It struck me in the interview with Lula, a kind of a sense almost of vindication of, hey, you finally realize that it's important that countries like mine have arrived. Last night I talked to a Chinese, at a Chinese press conference. I asked some questions. There was a different sense in talking to the Chinese than there had been just a few years ago. More authority, more of a sense of, hey, we belong, we've got authoritative things to say. And then Sachs himself, who said he's just never seen a meeting like this from the point of view of people from those countries talking in empowered ways.
Now, they also talked in this agreement about pledging to solve imbalances in the global economy. First, what does that mean, and what kind of reaction were you getting to that?
Basically, it means China saves too much, America spends too much, and so do other developed economies. So the idea is, how do you change that balance? That's what I asked the Chinese about last night, and what they said was, look, we're completely aware of this. We'd like to fix it. It is going to take a long time. We're spending a lot more, the Chinese said. We've got the biggest stimulus package in the world. They didn't say that, but I say that on a per capita basis. And so we're really trying to change, but it's a structural problem. I'm quoting one of the top Chinese officials last night, and it's going to take a long time to fix. So what the group here is pledging is, we're going to look at this, we're going to monitor it, we're going to take account of the imbalances, and through the IMF, which is being mentioned here more prominently than it has been in the past, through the IMF we're going to try to do something about it. But, you know, it's easy to say we're going to spend less in America or spend more in China, and quite another thing to actually have it happen.
Let me ask you one more brief thing before I let you go. There are, still debates here about whether we need more stimulus. In terms of where we are now, what was the sense of how much more, whether the international system needs to keep stimulating the economy and growth.
Yeah, I'm glad you added that because I'd forgotten. One of the things that seems to be coming out of the communique, I'm talking to you now just as it's coming out, but it seems to be that there's going to be a real emphasis on future stimulus. Now, I don't know what emphasis means, but one of the key phrase, the mantra is, it worked, meaning the stimulus, the coordinated effort of the world economy that IMF chief Strauss-Kahn was bragging about or so impressed by on the show when we talked to him just about a week ago, that they vow will continue, or at least they will not stop it right away. Now, it's tough to do that given the constituencies back home, but that seems to be part of what they are saying here very specifically. Yes, we're going to we're not going to stop. I don't know about going to continue so much as we're not going to stop. We're not going to let the world recovery slow down or come to a halt.
All right, Paul Solman in Pittsburgh for us this week. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Sure, Jeff.
And more on what came out of the summit now from Simon Johnson of the MIT Sloan School of Management and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Ishwar Prasad of Cornell University and the Brookings Institution. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
A year ago, we all sat here. The problem was to help us get out of the crisis and prevent it in the future. What does Pittsburgh tell you, Ishwar, about where we're at now?
Things have changed dramatically in the last few months. At the end of last year, it looked like the world economy was going off a cliff. All the major economies had hit a wall. And now the circumstances have changed, in part thanks, I think, to the resilience of market economies, but also thanks to these stimulative measures, which not only had a direct effect, but because the leaders took together and said we're going to take action together, I think that had a pretty positive effect on confidence. So all of that seems to have gotten us away from the edge of the cliff. So we are, in fact, in a much better position right now where we can start thinking about how to entrench the recovery and whether the measures put in place to get the recovery going should be pulled back or not.
All right, so Simon, before we get to the what's coming, what about that? And you heard Paul talk about this sense that it worked, stimulus worked.
Well, the last G20 summit, April in London, I think was successful. Exactly the reasons that Ishwar said. The governments, these big, powerful governments, and this is 90% of the world's economies in terms of GDP represented by the G20, they decided to try and stop the crisis and act together, and I think they did well. Unfortunately, since April, they've rather been resting on their laurels, to my perspective, and I'm not sure this Pittsburgh summit is really such a great moment.
Well, explain. Where does it fall short?
Well, on the kinds of measures that you'd think you would need to prevent this kind of crisis from happening again. For example, around the financial sector. There's been some very good rhetoric, for example, from the White House in the past couple of weeks, but very little in terms of specifics. And I'm afraid what we got today from Pittsburgh was more empty words, which is shocking and I think a little surprising given where we're coming from.
Do you see some more positive reaction or actions out of Pittsburgh?
I think the last three summits culminating with this one have in fact accomplished a lot. They have brought the emerging market economies firmly onto the table. I think the fact that the leaders have agreed that the G20 rather than the G7 or the G8 should be the primary forum for thinking about global economic policies is a big deal. The fact that there is some agreement, although the details still need to be worked out, about giving the emerging market economies more of a say at the International Monetary Fund, I think is a pretty big deal. So in terms of overall global governance, actually I think we have accomplished quite a bit. And remember, this is a very diverse group of economies, and the fact that they could agree even on some general principles, I think is quite an accomplishment. But whether we can get agreement on the specifics, of course, still remains the key issue.
All right, well, let's walk through a few of those things. Start with the one he just mentioned. The first one was the G20 out of the G8, and Paul talked about that, and he was quoting Jeffrey Sachs as a sort of historic moment. Is that a good move forward in itself?
It is a good move forward. The G7, the industrialized countries, had become an anachronism. They used to dominate the world economy. They don't dominate it anymore. The emerging markets are about half of world GDP. They do need to be at the table, no question about it. The problem is when you bring them into the kitchen, that's an awful lot of cooks. And can they agree on anything more than pretty general frameworks? We certainly need a lot more than that, for example, around the regulation of banks. But you didn't see today any concrete progress in that kind of direction.
Do you see at least having them at the table as an important step?
I think it's quite important for them to be at the table. If you think about issues like the global imbalances that we talked about, China is a very big part of it, and the other emerging market economies are a very big part of it. So unless we can involve them in the solution, we really are not going to get anywhere. So it is essential, I think, that they be part of the conversation about how to make progress. And Simon has a point that we don't have that many specifics coming out of this. But even here, I think there are some game changers. For instance, the notion that there should be a peer review process that is going to take account of countries' macroeconomic policies. There was a peer review process in place before through the IMF, but nobody cared very much about it, especially the big countries. But what is the game changer, I think, right now is that the US is saying that it is going to take the IMF more seriously, and I think this will force the other countries to take it more seriously. But there still isn't an enforcement mechanism, so we still have to see how this plays out.
Okay, what do you think of this peer review idea?
Well, I think the key is the enforcement mechanism that Ishwar said. Unless you have something concrete, something specific, you know, that you're going to be taken to the World Trade Organization, for example, for some sort of hearing or some sort of trade sanctions if you violate certain commitments. Unless you have that, nothing is going to change.
Back up though, how would it even work? I mean, help our viewers understand. What would a peer review entail? Who would do it?
Well, what it means in this instance, because the G20 doesn't have a regular secretariat, is that the IMF will be delegated with the task of reviewing the policies that the countries actually pursue, and every time there's a G20 summit, there'll be 2 next year, the IMF will make a report and it'll say these people are doing what they said they would do and these people are not. That's the idea. The problem is it all gets nuanced out in these IMF reports. Big countries do not like to be criticized by the IMF at all, and unless there's a commitment to some sort of enforcement mechanism, you're not really going to make any progress.
And then, of course, there's the structure, the global imbalance question that I asked Paul about, and a kind of structural problem. Do you see, are there details on moving forward on something like that?
It's going to be very tricky. One part of the global imbalances was the fact that China has a somewhat export-led growth model, meaning they really need the exports in order to generate jobs and in order to keep their growth model going. That hasn't really changed. In fact, the stimulus package they've put into place is going to make matters worse in the short run, because a lot of the stimulus spending is going towards investment. So they're building up a lot more capital stock. Household income growth is not quite keeping up, so they have to ship the stuff out somewhere. Likewise, Japan and Germany are still economies that very much rely on exports. So all of these economies are still looking to ride the US coattails. So that problem remains. But one fundamental thing has been achieved, that the emerging markets were also trying to build up foreign exchange reserves in order to protect themselves from crises. And 2 very big accomplishments of the G20 are that the amount of money that the International Monetary Fund has, and the International Monetary Fund acts as a sort of insurance mechanism for emerging markets, that's been raised from $250 billion to nearly $1 trillion. And second, the emerging markets now feel they have more of a say at the IMF. So they may feel much less of a need to self-insure by building up reserves, which could be a good thing.
Could that be a good thing? I mean, this is the global imbalance question. I mean, could that be a good thing, those kind of mechanisms?
I think this is the triumph of hope over experience, to be honest. I mean, the emerging markets don't trust the IMF. The IMF lost a lot of legitimacy after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, and it's not rebuilt it. So countries like China and Korea and Indonesia don't want to ever have to borrow from the IMF again. It's good the IMF has more money. That will help Eastern Europe, for example. But most of Asia and much of Latin America doesn't want to come back to the IMF, and there's nothing I can see at this G20 summit or in the broader G20 process that's going to rebuild IMF legitimacy. That is absolutely key to the points that Ishwar was addressing, which you need if you want to have a more stable world economy.
You know, I would just in the last minute, I would probably ask you this after each of the summits, but what's next? I mean, now there have been 3 of these summits. Do the governments go back and continue working on their own, or is there a chance for a kind of coordination?
Well, they referred a number of key matters to the Ministers of Finance who will meet in November. They need to get a move on. They have to solve the cross-border issues of what happens when big banks fail. They've not worked on that. They're saying they'll do that by the end of 2010. That's far too slow. They're going to raise capital requirements and tell us what the numbers are at the end of 2012. That's an eternity in today's financial markets. They really need to get a move on. I think they're dragging their feet and patting themselves too much on the back at the moment.
Ishwar, a last word?
This is a big challenge. I mean, the general principles are great, but getting down to the specifics is going to be very hard. In fact, some commitments that the G20 leaders made to much fanfare earlier, like saying that they would not take protectionist actions against free trade, they went back to their home countries, immediately pandered to the domestic constituencies by putting in place protectionist measures. So whether there is going to be the desire or the drive to follow through on these commitments really is an open question.
All right. Ishwar Prasad, Simon Johnson, thanks as always.
Thank you. My pleasure.